Have you ever looked into someone's eyes and seen a storm no one else noticed? A kind of emptiness, a quiet ache beneath the polite smile. You pass them by, exchange greetings, maybe even laugh together, but deep down, they're drowning in a silence no words have dared to break. Every single day, thousands of people around the world make a decision no one talks about until it's too late. They choose to leave this life, hoping to escape the unbearable weight pressing down on their hearts. And yet we rarely stop to ask, why? Why would someone step away from the one thing we cling to so desperately, life itself? We live in a world obsessed with appearances, filters on faces, highlight reels on social media. And beneath that shimmering surface, countless souls are quietly breaking. But here's the uncomfortable truth: pain doesn't always scream. It whispers. It hides in plain sight. And sometimes, the ones laughing the loudest are the ones hurting the most. Today, we open a door that's often kept shut. Not to sensationalize, not to pity, but because there's a wisdom, ancient and profound, that has faced this shadow for centuries, and it comes from the teachings of the Buddha. You see, Buddhism was never meant to be a religion of blind worship or distant rituals. It's a path, a living, breathing guide for the human experience, a way to navigate suffering, understand its roots, and, perhaps most importantly, learn how to meet it with compassion. And when it comes to the topic of suicide, Buddhism doesn't turn away. It looks directly at the pain, not with judgment but with clarity. Because here's something most people forget. Behind every act of suicide is a search, a desperate attempt to end suffering, to silence the storm. And if we don't learn to understand that suffering, to see it, name it, and offer a different way through, we risk losing countless more beautiful, irreplaceable lives to the shadows. This isn't a conversation about morality. It's a conversation about meaning, about what it means to hurt, to hope, and to heal. There's a quiet kind of courage in asking these questions, a bravery in sitting with discomfort long enough to hear what it has to teach us. And Buddhism, with its timeless insights into the nature of life, death, and rebirth, offers a perspective most of us have never been taught. Not in school, not in church, not in whispered conversations after funerals. It asks us to consider, is death truly the end? Does it bring peace? Or does it carry our suffering with us, following us like a shadow across lifetimes? What happens to a soul burdened by despair when it crosses that invisible threshold? Does it dissolve into nothingness, or awaken in a place shaped by the very emotions it tried to outrun? These aren't easy questions, but they are necessary. Because if we can understand suffering, if we can unravel its cause, we might just find a way to prevent its most devastating consequence. And if you've ever felt that ache yourself, if you've ever stood on the edge of your own darkness, unsure whether the next step would be forward or forever, you deserve to know that there is wisdom older than your pain. A wisdom that does not condemn you. A wisdom that speaks gently and says, "Come sit beside me. Let's look at this together." So stay, not because this video will fix everything, not because words alone can mend a heart that feels shattered, but because sometimes, understanding even one small truth about the nature of life can be enough to shift the weight on your chest, to breathe a little deeper, to find the tiniest spark of light in the thickest darkness. And that's where we'll begin. A conversation not about death, but about the life you still carry, about the invisible battles no one else can see, and about what ancient wisdom says to those standing at the edge. Let's walk through it together. There's something strange about life. We barely notice it until we're afraid of losing it. A heartbeat, a breath, a quiet pulse beneath your skin. It's the most ordinary, yet most precious thing you possess. And in the teachings of the Buddha, this truth is reflected with a kind of fierce tenderness. In Buddhism, there are 5 fundamental moral guidelines, known as the 5 precepts, simple, profound vows meant to guide us away from suffering and toward peace. And the very first, above all others, is this: I undertake the precept to refrain from taking life. Not just human life, all life. The buzzing insect, the bird in the tree, the stranger on the street, the animal you'll never meet. But why? Why is life held so sacred in a philosophy that teaches us to let go of attachments? Why cling to this fleeting, fragile spark if, in the end, we're asked to release everything? The answer isn't about clinging. It's about recognizing the immeasurable potential contained within every living being, the capacity for awakening, for transformation, for liberation. To the Buddha, every life holds within it the seed of enlightenment, even in the darkest heart, even in the most tormented soul. And when someone takes a life, including their own, they aren't just ending an existence. They are cutting short a journey, interrupting a sacred process meant to unfold through countless moments, joys, sorrows, and realizations. Buddhism teaches that life is our precious opportunity to understand the nature of suffering, to dissolve ignorance, and to cultivate compassion. And it's easy to forget that when you're drowning in pain, when your mind tells you there's no escape, no meaning left. But the first precept whispers something different. It reminds us, this moment, no matter how unbearable, is not the totality of your story. Because what you feel today, this ache, this weight, this silent storm, it too is impermanent. It rises, it falls, it changes. And in the space between one breath and the next, there lies the potential for something new, a sliver of clarity, a flicker of peace. That's why life is sacred in the Buddhist view. Not because it's free from suffering, but because it offers us the chance to end suffering. When we choose to remain, to witness even one more sunrise, to hear one more piece of music, to feel the warmth of a stranger's kindness, we allow the possibility of transformation. Not every day will be beautiful. Many will be unbearably hard. But even the worst days carry within them a doorway if we're willing to look. And here's something few people realize. The first precept isn't just about preventing harm to others. It's about protecting yourself, recognizing the sacredness of your own existence, even when your mind tries to convince you otherwise. In Buddhist thought, suicide is seen not as an unforgivable sin, but as a profound tragedy, a sorrowful misunderstanding of life's potential. Because the act doesn't extinguish suffering, it often carries it forward. According to the laws of karma and rebirth, the unresolved pain, the clinging, the fear, these energies do not simply vanish. They follow the consciousness into the next form, shaping the circumstances of future existence. That's not a punishment. It's a natural continuation, like a ripple on water, extending long after the stone has sunk. This is why preserving life matters, not because you are bound to endure endless suffering, but because every breath offers a chance to learn how to be free from it. And sometimes, the smallest acts of compassion toward ourselves, choosing to stay, to breathe, to seek help, are the most courageous. The first precept isn't a commandment from a distant God. It's an invitation, a quiet vow you make to yourself, to honor the life within you, no matter how broken it feels, to remember that your story is not over, that within your pain lies the same spark of awakening the Buddha discovered beneath the Bodhi tree. And it's waiting for you, patiently, silently, in the quiet moments when you least expect it. So perhaps tonight you stay, not because you feel like it, not because it's easy, but because somewhere within you there's a truth you've yet to meet, a wisdom deeper than this ache, a light that still belongs to you. And when you're ready, we'll follow that light a little further, not in search of false hope, but in search of understanding. Because what if the very pain you wish to escape is also the place where your freedom begins? You've probably heard the saying, "What goes around comes around." It's a simple phrase, easy to dismiss, but beneath those words lies one of the most profound and misunderstood truths in all of Buddhist philosophy: karma. Not some cosmic punishment, not a supernatural force that tracks your sins with a ledger in the sky. Karma is far more intimate than that. It's the quiet echo of your own actions, thoughts, and intentions, rippling through the fabric of your life. In Buddhism, karma isn't fate, it's cause and effect. A simple law as natural as gravity. Every word you speak, every thought you nurture, every choice you make. They plant seeds, some sprout quickly, others lie dormant for years. but eventually they bear fruit. And here's where the illusion begins. When someone is trapped in unbearable pain, the mind starts whispering a dangerous lie. If I end this life, the suffering ends too. It's a hauntingly convincing thought. The promise of silence, of oblivion, of nothingness. But according to the Buddha's teachings, death isn't the final escape. It's a doorway, a transition. You see, the consciousness, what some might call the mind, the spirit, the subtle energy of awareness, doesn't dissolve when the body falls away. It carries forward, shaped by the momentum of the life just lived. And what propels it? Karma, the unresolved pain, the clinging, the unhealed wounds, the love left unspoken. It all travels with you like a river carrying fallen leaves. And so the suffering you tried to outrun meets you again in another form, another place, another fragile body in a life you can't remember asking for. This is samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Not as a punishment, but as a reflection of cause and effect endlessly playing itself out. Now, some might ask, isn't that cruel? That even death won't grant peace. But here's the subtle wisdom often missed. The cycle isn't meant to trap you. It's meant to wake you, to make you realize that the escape you seek isn't found in obliteration. It's found in understanding, in transforming the causes of suffering, not just the symptoms. Suicide in Buddhist philosophy is seen not with moralistic condemnation, but with immense compassion. It's recognized as a moment of deep delusion, a desperate attempt to extinguish the pain without understanding its roots. And those roots, they're not in the circumstances around you, not in the people who wronged you, not in the failures or heartbreaks. They're in craving, in the relentless grasping for something different than what is, for pleasure without pain, for life without loss, for self without impermanence. The Buddha taught that as long as this craving remains, the wheel of rebirth turns, and no door, no blade, no cliff's edge can stop it. But there's good news buried in that hard truth. Because if suffering is created by causes, it can also be uncreated by new causes. If karma propels the cycle, wisdom can break it. And it begins, not with dramatic acts of heroism, but in tiny, stubborn acts of awareness. In pausing when your mind spirals, in breathing through the ache, in sitting for just one moment with what is instead of running from it. Those moments plant new seeds, and slowly the tangled web of old karma begins to loosen. You might ask, isn't that too little too late? And I'll tell you this, it's never too late, because the mind that contemplates suicide is the same mind capable of enlightenment. A single thought of compassion, of clarity, can shift the course of countless lifetimes. And here's a deeper truth. The Buddha himself faced unimaginable suffering in his lifetimes before awakening. Countless rebirths, countless losses, countless deaths. But each life carried him closer to freedom. And yours can too. The illusion isn't just in believing death will end the pain. The illusion is believing you are bound by it forever. That you have no choice but to obey the storm inside your head. But what if you did? What if, in the very heart of despair, you found not escape but awakening? Because the moment you stop running, the moment you turn and face the ache without flinching, you start to see it for what it is. Not an enemy, not a curse, but a teacher. And the Buddha called suffering the noble truth for a reason, because it contains within it the map to your freedom. So perhaps tonight, rather than seeking a way out, you begin seeking a way through. And if that sounds unbearable, remember, you don't have to do it alone. The path has been walked by many, and it's waiting for you too, somewhere just beyond the illusion. Up until now, we've spoken of life as sacred, of karma as a tide that carries the consequences of our actions far beyond the grave, and of the aching human illusion that death could be a final escape. But here's a truth rarely spoken aloud. Even in the ancient Buddhist texts, there are whispers of exceptions, moments where those who walked the path of awakening stepped into death by their own hand, not out of despair, not from the clutches of craving, but from a place few of us can even imagine: complete detachment, absolute freedom, total clarity. One of the most haunting and controversial stories is that of Vakali Thera. Vakali was a devoted monk, one whose heart overflowed with reverence for the Buddha, but his body betrayed him. Illness gnawed at his flesh. Pain curled around his bones like a snake, and yet his mind remained unshaken. Through years of ceaseless suffering, he meditated. He watched the rising and passing of pain. He transcended the craving for ease, the clinging to life. And in his final days, Vakali understood something few mortals ever glimpse: that his body was no longer a vessel but a decaying garment. His mind was free. There was no self left to protect, no craving left to bind him to this world. So, in one final act of detachment, he took his own life. And according to the scriptures, the Buddha spoke not in rebuke, but in profound compassion, affirming that Vakali had reached liberation. Now, let's be careful here, because to those unfamiliar with the depths of Buddhist philosophy, this can sound like permission, a dangerous justification for despair. But make no mistake, what made Vakali's death different wasn't the act, it was the mind behind it. He was not running from pain. He wasn't clinging to non-existence. He wasn't seeking escape from suffering because he had already transcended it. The body, for him, was no longer an object of attachment. Life, no longer a craving. Death, no longer an ending. This is not something ordinary minds can imitate. And the ancient teachers were clear. To mistake despair for detachment is to invite deeper suffering. There are a handful of these rare, enigmatic stories, other monks and nuns whose final acts came not from sorrow, but from an utter emptiness of craving. Like the tale of Godhika Thera, another monk battling chronic illness. After reaching states of meditative absorption again and again, only to fall back due to his weakening body, he finally chose to sever the tie to his form. And in his final moments, he attained nirvana, the total cessation of suffering, the extinction of craving, the dissolution of the cycle. It's important to understand these aren't examples to follow. They're reminders of a deeper truth, that the value of a life isn't measured by its length, but by the freedom of the mind within it. And that true liberation isn't about dying, it's about awakening. For most of us, caught in the tangle of emotions, regrets, and attachments, death by our own hand would only carry the weight of unresolved karma into another form. But for those exceedingly rare souls who have dissolved the self, who neither desire life nor fear death, the final letting go becomes not an escape, but a return to the vast, unconditioned silence the Buddha called nibbana. And yet, even the Buddha cautioned against romanticizing these tales. He knew how fragile the human mind could be, how easily the desperate heart mistakes silence for peace and oblivion for freedom. Which is why, for the countless beings still trapped in suffering, the noble path was laid out: to stay, to face the storms, to walk slowly, one mindful step at a time until the illusions dissolve. The stories of Vakali and Godhika are not lanterns lighting our way forward. They are distant stars, reminders of what's possible, but not prescriptions for the suffering heart. Because for us, for now, the work remains here. In this life, in this moment, in this breath. And if the weight of your suffering feels unbearable, know this: the Buddha didn't walk away from suffering. He sat with it under a tree for 7 days and 7 nights until it showed him its true face. And what he found wasn't annihilation. It was awakening. Perhaps so can you. It's a story as old as human sorrow. A lone figure stands before a world steeped in cruelty and makes one final, irrevocable gesture. Throughout history, men and women have taken their own lives not from personal despair, but as a form of protest. A cry meant to awaken the sleeping, to shake the apathetic, to wound the conscience of a silent world. But what does Buddhism, with its reverence for life and its warnings about the karmic weight of suicide, say about this? It's a question that has haunted generations. Perhaps the most iconic image of protest suicide in modern memory is that of Thich Qu letter 1EA3 and G D-letter 1E9C, the Vietnamese monk who, in 1963, calmly seated himself in the middle of a bustling Saigon street, poured gasoline over his saffron robes, and set himself alight. The photograph of his burning, unmoving body, seated in perfect lotus posture, would circle the globe. It became a symbol of resistance against oppression, a testimony of sacrifice, a searing indictment of inhumanity. And yet, even here, Buddhism asks us to look deeper. Was this compassion or tragedy, awakening or illusion? In the teachings of the Buddha, the intention behind any action is what gives it karmic weight. It's not merely what we do, it's why we do it. When a person ends their life in anger, hopelessness, or craving for escape, the karmic consequences are heavy, because the mind in that moment is clouded. The heart is clenched. The self clings desperately to the idea of annihilation as release. But when an act, even as extreme as death by one's own hand, is performed without attachment, without hatred, without delusion, purely for the benefit of others, then it exists in a different realm entirely. And this is where Thich Q U letter 1EA3, NG D stroke letter 1E9C's story becomes a paradox. By all accounts, he was a man of profound meditative attainment. His final words were a plea for compassion and peace, not vengeance. His death was not a scream of agony, but a silent, immovable testament to the depth of his renunciation. But even so, the ancient texts caution against romanticizing such acts, because for the vast majority of us still bound by craving, still haunted by ego, suicide, even in protest, risks entangling us deeper in the web of samsara. It's one thing to offer one's life. It's another to cling to death as a weapon. The Buddha taught that the highest form of protest is to embody peace in the face of violence, to live in such a way that your life itself becomes a rebuke to injustice. There's a haunting passage in the Dhammapada. Hatred is never appeased by hatred. Hatred is only appeased by love. This is an eternal law. And yet, human history is filled with hearts so broken by suffering, so moved by the agony of others, that they choose to make their own death a final, desperate act of mercy. Is this compassion, or is it tragedy dressed in noble clothing? Perhaps it is both, because Buddhism acknowledges the unbearable weight of suffering. It understands the fierce, desperate longing to end injustice, and it never condemns the human heart for breaking beneath that burden. But it also reminds us gently, relentlessly, that the path to true change lies not in death, but in awakening, that the deepest revolutions are not born in flames, but in the quiet, steady transformation of the mind. Even the great monks who burned in protest did not condemn those who lived. They asked only that others awaken. Because, as the Buddha saw beneath the Bodhi tree, suffering is a universal inheritance, and liberation for ourselves and others can never come from more suffering. It must come from wisdom, from courage, from a refusal to meet violence with violence, or despair with annihilation. Which is why, even today, Buddhist teachers approach the subject of protest suicide with immense caution, honoring the sacrifice, but urging the living to seek other ways, ways that do not pass the burden of grief and trauma onto those left behind, ways that turn pain into understanding and injustice into relentless, mindful compassion. In the end, every life lost, whether by protest or despair, leaves a wake of questions. What could have been different? What might have healed that heart? What thread of wisdom might have pulled them back from the edge? And though we cannot rewrite the past, Buddhism offers a quiet, radical promise that no matter how broken this world becomes, no matter how deep the darkness, the mind can still awaken, here, now, without self-destruction, without hatred, without despair. And in that awakening lies the truest form of protest the universe has ever known. Somewhere right now, someone is sitting alone in a silent room, staring into the emptiness. The weight in their chest feels unbearable. The mind loops through old wounds, regrets, and what-ifs. And for a moment, a long, aching moment, it seems like there's no way out. Despair is a darkness that convinces us it will last forever. And yet, the Buddha taught nothing lasts forever. The first truth, so simple it stings, is this: life is suffering, not because the world is cruel, but because we cling to what can't stay. We chase pleasure, we run from pain, and in the space between, we lose ourselves. But here's what makes Buddhism different. It doesn't tell you to ignore your suffering. It doesn't promise to take it away. It tells you to look directly into it, to sit quietly beside your despair and ask it, "What are you teaching me?" You see, despair isn't a flaw in you. It's not proof that you're weak or broken or unworthy. It's a signal, a desperate, pleading message from the mind and heart that something you've built your life upon is unstable. Maybe it's an attachment. Maybe it's an illusion of control. Maybe it's the belief that you are alone. The Buddha compared human suffering to being shot with an arrow. When struck, most of us don't pull the arrow out. We obsess over who fired it, why it happened, whether it was fair, whether we deserved it. And all the while, we bleed. The Buddhist way is different. It doesn't waste time blaming the past or fantasizing about a future escape. It teaches us to gently, carefully remove the arrow and tend to the wound with compassion. How? Through what the Buddha called the Noble Eightfold Path. Not a set of commandments, not a list of punishments and rewards, but a roadmap, a way of walking through this chaotic, impermanent world with wisdom, kindness, and clarity. It begins with right view, seeing the world not as we wish it to be, but as it truly is. Recognizing that joy and sorrow rise and fall like waves, and that chasing one while fleeing the other only deepens our suffering. Then comes right intention, cultivating thoughts not of anger, greed, or violence, but of renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. The path winds through right speech, right action, and right livelihood, learning to live in ways that do not harm others, and by extension, do not deepen our own despair. And it culminates in right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The tools by which we steady the restless mind, open the clenched heart, and come home to the present moment. Because here's the secret Buddhism quietly whispers. The mind you have now, burdened, weary, aching, is not fixed. It is not doomed. It is not your enemy. It is a field waiting to be tended. And through practice, through meditation, through compassion, through letting go, the mind transforms. Not by force, not by denial, but by understanding. One day you sit with your sorrow and realize it has softened. It no longer claws at you. It becomes a companion, a reminder of your humanness, and a teacher pointing to what truly matters. Despair loses its power not because it vanishes, but because you stop believing its lies. Even the Buddha himself faced despair. Before his enlightenment, sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, he was tempted by every illusion, every fear, every craving to give up. But he remained, not by fighting the darkness, but by understanding its nature. And in that stillness, he saw what we too can see. That every thought, every sorrow, every desperate urge to escape is just a cloud passing through the open sky of awareness. And the sky, vast, silent, boundless, is untouched. That sky is your true nature. The Buddhist way to overcome despair is not to crush it, not to escape it, but to awaken within it. To realize you were never truly lost. You simply forgot the boundless, radiant awareness that holds all your pain, your joy, your life, without resistance. And when that happens, when, even for a moment, you touch that peace, despair no longer owns you. The world may still be broken, your life may still be uncertain, but you are no longer drowning. You are awake, and from that awakening, you'll find not only the strength to live, but the wisdom to help others rise from their despair too. There's something profoundly human about staring into the unknown, about standing at the edge of suffering so deep, it feels like it might swallow you whole. And yet, again and again, countless lives before us have stood at that very same edge and stepped back into the light. Buddhism doesn't shy away from death. It doesn't pretend it's not coming, but neither does it treat it as the final word. The Buddha taught that what we call death is not an ending but a doorway, a moment of transition in the endless unfolding of causes and conditions, a ripple in a boundless ocean. And in this understanding, there's a message of quiet, luminous hope. Because even at our darkest, even when despair whispers that there's no return, the truth remains unchanged. This life, fleeting as it is, matters. Every breath you take, every tear you shed, every moment you choose to stay, to try, to love again, it leaves an imprint on the vast tapestry of existence. You may feel invisible in your suffering, but you are not forgotten, and you are never truly alone. The Buddhist path reminds us that within every being is a seed of awakening, a timeless awareness untouched by sorrow, by despair, by the illusions of this temporary world. And though we might forget it in our hardest hours, it waits for us patiently. Like the sun behind a storm, never lost, only hidden. For those who have known the ache of hopelessness, who have questioned the worth of their days, remember this. Despair is a liar. It tells you this moment will last forever, but it won't. The mind changes, the heart heals, the impossible becomes bearable, and one day what once felt like an endless night will give way to dawn. If you're listening to this now, it means you're still here, still breathing, still carrying within you the quiet courage to seek understanding. That is no small thing. And if, in some small way, these words have brought you a measure of peace or reminded you of your worth, hold on to that. Share it, carry it to others who might need it. Because in this vast, interconnected web of life, your presence matters more than you'll ever know. Before we close, if this message spoke to you, if you felt seen, comforted, or quietly awakened, I invite you to stay connected with us. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone you care about, and leave a comment below. Tell us your story, your thoughts, or even just a word of hope for someone else who might be listening in the dark. You never know whose life you might touch. This is more than a channel. It's a gathering place for seekers, for survivors, for those who refuse to give up on the quiet, extraordinary miracle of being alive. May you be well. May you find peace. And may you remember, even in your darkest night, the boundless light that's always been within you. Until we meet again, namaste.